So news has come out of a prominent MMA manager, and he's talking about how more and more fighters are wanting to stop re-signing the contract extensions with the UFC and try their hand at boxing, right? And this was all due to the success of Francis Ngannou coming along and absolutely claiming the bag in his fight with Tyson Fury. Now, I wanted to make a video and talk about this because as a longtime MMA fan, this is a little bit concerning when you start to look at how this might play out in the overall MMA UFC landscape going forward. If more and more fighters want to build their talent in the UFC and then start to want to back out and not go ahead and keep fighting with the UFC after they've made a name for themselves. It's such a wild situation that we have found ourselves in, and it's one that would not exist if it wasn't for the Saudi money, right? The Saudi money that is, it's come in and completely, it's changed the game of prize fighting and ruined the economics of what was going on when it came to building up all of that talent, right? The name of the game was to go out and find talent and then see if you could actually build them up and turn a profit on them. And by talent, I mean young fighters that you could see bubbling up into stars. Whether or not we have the debate of Sean O'Malley is a star or he isn't a star, the UFC found him, promoted him, built him up. Now he's finally headlining his own main event as a champion. And that is essentially the name of the game that the UFC has created, right? In the 80s and 90s, what boxing did and how boxing handled this was to just go out, find this young talent, and then keep putting them up against cans. Keep padding their record, doing exactly what Jake Paul just did this weekend that none of us were impressed by, until they could get a young fighter or a middle-aged 30-year-old fighter who had 30-0 next to him on a poster, and then do it with somebody else and get that boxer to have 30-0 on his poster as well, and put them together and try and sell a fight as somebody's O has got to go. But it was all done through just crushing cans the entire way. That was pretty much what boxing did in the 80s and 90s, and it was slowly killing the sport. Like, nobody was interested in boxing back then. What the UFC did was they pretty much set up their own organization and allowed fighters to build themselves inside of it, and also forgive fighters if they had a loss by showing off the talent of the entire organization. If one fighter lost and ruined that record and didn't have that shiny O next to their name, it was okay, because it was all being shown off in this entire almost platform of a fighting experience, you know? And the UFC has really become this thing like YouTube or Spotify. It's a place for young fighters to come and showcase their talent and to build their name and their fame up in not only the fighting world, but because the UFC has now gotten so big and is at least mainstream enough to be on ESPN, a lot of their fighters are building the name up in the mainstream world as well, outside of the fighting world. Now, with the Saudi money arriving in the game, there's this new force out there that is willing to pay athletes that have made a name for themselves without worrying about turning a profit on those athletes. Like, look at what we just saw with PFL versus Bellator, okay? All funded by Saudi money, all of it funded by Saudi money, but not a chance that it turned a single dollar's worth of profit, okay? Look at the trouble that Francis Ngannou was having trying to get his boxing contract signed outside of the UFC for almost the first year. Every single fighting organization in the world that is trying to actually build up a real company and turn a profit said that what Francis was asking for was completely insane, until the PFL came along, backed by the Saudi money, and actually got that deal done. Now that that has happened and we are living in that post-moment world, other fighters, including Conor McGregor, it looks like the reason that we are not getting this Conor McGregor fight that we all know should be happening soon. Why isn't Conor fighting? He's healed up. It has been over 6 months. His body has started to shrink. He is clearing the steroids out of his system. Why are we not getting this Conor McGregor fight? It's obvious that it's coming down to these contract negotiations, and it must be because there is something more enticing for him out there, which is obviously the Saudi money. I mean, he has been down there for every single one of their events. He is clearly in talks with them, and there is something going on between the UFC's biggest superstar and Conor McGregor, and I'm sure that there are other fighters on the roster that are doing a little bit of noticing as well. So of course, it's these fighters that want to go ahead and sell their name, their star power to the highest bidder. And that's all well and good. I completely understand why every single person wants to sell their services for the highest price. That makes total sense. But it's the UFC that invested all the money in setting up all the infrastructure and building up that fighter's name. It's the UFC that was losing money on that fighter's early career to get that fighter out there in front of the fans and start to build their name up. And now this tide is sort of going to start to turn if this happens, a fighter's not re-signing their contracts. How long can you have a company like the UFC go on for turning a profit? I understand it's turning massive profits today, but the whole business model is set up on fighters re-signing their contracts once they've actually made a name for themselves and then being able to get those long-term profits back. So I guess the argument could then be it's all timing, right? Like, how long should a fighter stay with the UFC before they leave? Like, surely the UFC have gotten their return on investment on Conor McGregor. Nobody is asking that, right? But let's look at the Sean O'Malley example again, okay? Sean O'Malley is only just starting to really step into what Sean O'Malley could be. If Sean O'Malley was to go and quit after his very first title defense, I mean, how many defenses did Francis have? One, two? One maybe. I think he just defended against Cyril Gane and then he bounced. He won it against Stipe, he defended against Cyril and then he bounced. When is it the right time for a UFC star to just walk away, yeah? Like, is Dustin Poirier at that stage yet? Conor McGregor obviously is at that stage yet. Is Dustin there yet? You have to start looking at the roster and start to see just how many of these fighters have actually stepped into that profitability mode yet. And again, obviously there's going to be people out there that say every single fighter should be just a free agent and constantly looking to sign just the biggest deal that they can get for every single fight. And that is one way to look at it. But there is also other people out there that say, you know, the UFC don't pay their fighters enough. So the UFC deserves this to happen to them. But it's not just the fighters from a fight card that the UFC pays, right? The UFC also pays the commentators, they pay the doctors, they pay the referees, they pay the editors for the show, they pay the sound and light guys, they pay the caterers that are feeding everybody out at the press conference out the back. They have opened up the performance institutes all over the world, and everyone inside those performance institutes, from the chefs there to the coaches there to the guy mopping the floor, every single one of those people on every single step along the way, the UFC's social media team, they all get paid every single week to create this platform to give us cards like the Apex card that we just had this weekend for young fighters like Oliveira, who just fought this weekend on the prelims, to go ahead and showcase his skills to the world on ESPN. It's sort of a group effort here, what we're creating for fighters all over the world. Young Mexican fighters can now go step into the Performance Institute, and everyone in that Performance Institute is all getting paid off what is happening, off what the UFC has created. And every other company is losing money trying to copy what the UFC is doing and only doing it half as well. Boxing promotions are notorious for only paying the main event, the people at the very top of the card, maybe the co-main as well, the really big, good money. And everyone else below it are notoriously paid absolutely dog shit. As well as boxing promotions are also notorious for constantly going bankrupt and shutting down and folding into other companies. The Saudis can put on these big shows, but I'm not sure the people who built the stadium that the Saudis are showing these events in, I'm not sure they're getting paid a living wage. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're not getting paid anything at all. It's always very interesting to me when I see these bleeding hearts out there like Luke Thomas and Ariel Helwani, who are always crying for fair pay for the fighters, cheer on talent being poached away from the UFC by the Saudis. And the Saudis use people that literally don't get paid at all to be able to put on events like that. To me, it just seems like very level one thinking, and it misses the complexity of what the UFC has actually created and what is going on. So with this manager having several fighters talking about how these UFC fighters want to leave and go try their hand at boxing. Is it a good or a bad thing, right? It might be really, really good for those particular fighters at that particular stage of their career. The Conor McGregors, the Francis Ngannous, the Dustin Poiriers, maybe the Sean O'Malley's, maybe even fighters like Masvidal and Kevin Holland. It might be really, really good for them, but they're the established talent that exists today. But the young guys on the prelims, or the young guys fighting over at the Cage Warriors prelims, the guys who are still trying to build their talent and maybe want to have a future in cage fighting, even the guy that does the sound and lighting who works for LFA, which is also sponsored by the UFC and Fight Pass. I don't know if the Saudi money is going to be there for them in a few years' time. And for us, the fans, I don't know if the Saudi money is going to be there for them. That gives us amazing fight cards every single month at a UFC pay-per-view, where everyone is in one organization and the matchmaking is so clearly done. It's already kind of challenging for the UFC to do their matchmaking, as we see, with everyone already in one organization. If the Saudi money comes ahead and just keeps smashing everything to pieces, what is the game going to look like in 5 years' time? And how easy is that going to be for a fan to follow and for a young fighter to try and make their name in? I think, as always, it's a two-sided argument. Well done for the fighter that can go out there today and get as much money as he possibly can for this fight. But for the fans, how often are you going to see that fighter fight again? How often between fights do we have for these athletes who are on $10 million contracts? They sort of lose that hunger. It's also a lot harder for the matchmaking. And for the young talent coming up, if there's no established organization, where do they have a chance to grow? I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer here. I think there's just ways to look at it. So let me know your thoughts down there in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And of course, I'll see you all in the next one.